So yeah, that was
Yeah,
my day yesterday. So today started out really well. I went ended up because of that just going to bed, just straight to bed. So like
yeah.
I'm well rested for the first time in ages. I have a day off tomorrow. Um, yeah,
So over the 9 to 5, right?
yeah, very over the 9 to 5, man. And like I don't know, I just there was an article posted on LinkedIn last night, and it was about like why businesses are trying to get engineers to or people to return to work, right? And it was all like about the cost of like the land. I can't think of the word. It starts with an R. I haven't finished my coffee
Real
yet.
estate.
The real estate, and I was like, that's true. I totally get that, but like, why is that a worker's problem to solve? Like,
Right. It's not.
like I'm not going to work or like going to an office and wasting my time so that you can justify your large corporate footprint.
Yeah, and if you pull that money back, right? You could spend it somewhere else. You could give
Yeah,
you could pay employees more, you could do bonuses, you could contribute to more of like the the global economy or the economy at least in the places that you care about as opposed to, we're spending millions of dollars a year on, not only the building, right? Leasing the building
yeah,
or the maintenance of the building, the electricity, right? The internet to the building, all that stuff just adds up. So you're spending like millions of dollars each year
yeah.
doing that.
Or take the loss. The other thought is like, I mean, corporations have a lot of options here. I don't think all of them are bring your employees back to office, but the other option is to take the loss as a tax write-off and turn that space into a space for public good.
Yeah,
Like,
we've talked about this before. There's a lot of options there.
yeah,
Hopefully,
I mean,
one of these days we'll get to do
I
something with it.
I mean, I think that statement is entirely inspired by some of like the thoughts that you haven't shared on the podcast, but that we have talked about. Because like, I love that idea of like just converting that space into a space for public good, and then like cool, like now we all benefit from it, not just you know I don't know somebody else.
Right. Well, there's something I kind of wanted to talk about today, and it was inspired by uh, some of the stuff I've seen in the past, experienced, and then an article that I read recently, and it's related to sacred cows. I know you're familiar with this.
Yeah, yeah.
And
Just to unpack that a little bit, like by sacred cows, you don't mean actual cows.
no, no, I'm going to explain in a second. So
Okay, cool.
when working at USA, we had a manager, Glenn,
Yeah,
really great manager, one of the best managers I've ever had. And he used to
absolutely.
always say, there are no sacred cows.
Yeah.
So before we unpack that with what I think it is, I said, hey, look, why don't we leverage ChatGPT or Google Bard? So I asked Google Bard, I said, what are sacred cows in software? And this is what Bard came back and said. Sacred cow is a belief or practice that is held to be unquestionable and beyond criticism.
Yeah.
Now, there's a lot more to that, right? So one of those things could be the use of a particular programming language or framework, meaning this is the language we use, right? And for a lot of like React fanatics, it's React all
Yeah.
the way,
I was about
right?
to say
React or
React.
die.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, Another way could be that a way that a software developer is tested. Software is developed and tested, and also like deployments, things like that. So it could be a ton of things.
Yeah.
So, but I also wanted to stress that because it's not just like a specific pattern, it could also be a process. And
Yeah.
it doesn't even have to be like a software development process. It could be how we hold our meetings. It could be, you know, Agile Manifesto, right? All
I was
in.
about to say, Ram, are you going to tell me that Agile could be a sacred cow that we can kill?
Absolutely is. Right. So sacred cows, I think we all have like our own little definition. That's the one that I got from Bard. But I loved when Glenn would always say this, right? And what he was trying to reiterate was that just because we've done something like this or that in the past, it doesn't mean that we have to propagate it. We don't have to continue doing it
Yeah.
just because we've done it in the past and it maybe it worked.
Yeah. There was a LinkedIn post. I know I'm referencing LinkedIn a lot. I've been on LinkedIn a lot lately. Let's not talk about why. Uh, but
Uh-oh. Is that are we talking about the zombie LinkedIn account?
yeah. Anyways, LinkedIn, there's a post and they said it said something like the most dangerous responses to the question of why are we doing this is, well, that's the way we've always done it, or that's the way we do things here. And I remember early on in my engineering journey running into that answer a lot. Well, that like, I don't know, I've told this story on the podcast before, asking the question of like why we return nulls in Java functions instead of throwing an exception. And I remember getting the answer, well, that's the way we do things here. And well, and also I think I told that story before, being told that if I didn't understand that, then I needed to go learn Java. Which was both dismissive of the question and defensive of the process, which is like I think the core of a sacred cow is like where we don't question these things.
Right. And what they do is so I have this like mental picture. I like to build mental models or pictures of things. And we were talking about this in the past. Like I'm kind of like a big like movie buff from the I grew up in
Yeah,
the 80s. Well, we both did. Okay.
yeah.
But it's funny. I'm gonna go on a little tangent here and then I'm gonna come back to the whole thing. But I grew up in the 80s and we saw a lot of movies and it's funny with my kids I've been kind of um revisiting some of those. So like with my kids we started watching Back to the Future. We saw like Speed, some of the movies, that I grew up with. We're
Mm-hmm.
gonna see like E.T. coming up real soon. But um, you know, I think about like movies. So you've got the
Wait, wait,
sacred
wait,
cow.
Ram. I'm sorry, I have to interrupt. You didn't mention the Goonies.
Well,
Did y'all
no,
watch?
that's on the list. We have a list
Okay,
of like
okay,
movies that I'm gonna. Oh man, there's so many
yeah,
that we're gonna kind of just watch it. And it's funny because my kids actually are interested in them.
they're good
Those
movies.
yeah, they're good movies. And what's interesting is they focus more on the storytelling than on
Mm,
the special effects. Today it's all
right.
about like spectacle. It's not about story. It's just stuff's just blowing up everywhere.
Mm.
Cities just being destroyed. Anyway, so I think about a scene from a movie, right? When you think about like the sacred cow, and you attempt to change it or ask the question of why, and all of a sudden the alarms start going off, the lasers come down, the bars come up, right? And you're like, oh, you're locked out. It's like Indiana Jones or something, right? You got to
Yeah,
run, and here's this thing chasing you because that's how they're treated. It's basically you don't ask about it, don't even attempt to change it. And I've got a specific example that I want to talk about here in a second, but it's basically just a black box. It's
yeah,
off limits, and sometimes they're written by somebody who doesn't work here anymore. They're
yeah,
written by a rock star developer, right? Who like knew all the things and he created this magical process and he or she
yeah.
created this magical process and nobody can understand it. So therefore, and it works, we just leave it alone. Oh, wait, you need to do something that kind of the black box does? Just do it on the side. We'll just kind of replicate that process. Instead of, you know, making some changes in here and making it more generic, we'll just create a duplicate process on the side because we don't go into the black box, right? We don't
Right, right.
touch the sacred cow. There's there's an example that I have that I just have to say. It was at one of the
Yeah,
last companies I worked at, and I have no problem with higher order components, right? They're useful. It was a huge pattern for think about that.
for a long
Higher
time.
order components were themselves the sacred cow, right? They were the pattern that we followed to a T without deviation. Oh, you
Right.
need to do this? Higher order components.
Yep.
Again, so there's the pattern there. And there was this higher order component. Well, there was many of them, but one of them was called with record. And with record was the sacred cow here. It was like by far the most, it was the golden platinum sacred cow, and you didn't even look at it. And what it did was, so first of all, when I got there, I would ask people, hey, what's this thing? It's called with record. What's this thing? Oh, it's a hierarchical component that does this and this and this. Really vague explanation because they didn't build it either. They didn't really have an understanding of it. And it's like, yeah, basically we just when we need something, we just do this. Encapsulate the component that we want in that hierarchical component.
Yeah.
And there was lots of problems with that because data came in to the process,
Hmm.
black box stuff happened, and then you got some stuff out. There were all these transformations happening in there,
Yeah.
like dependent requests, those kinds of things, and in some cases, like circular dependencies and requests were happening. So you ended up with like some unintentional re-renders, things like that. And then here you go, here's your data on a plate. But if you needed to inspect it, if you needed to kind of understand it better, you couldn't.
Yeah.
because it's a black box. You can't go in there, right? You can't. And let's say you needed to change something just a little bit. Well, you couldn't do it in the black box. You had to do it somewhere. And so I started to dig in to this with record higher order component. And I started to understand it. And after you understand something, so the understanding part is the key, first of all. We're going to come back to like, how do you get away from sacred cows? So
Yeah.
I understood it. I created a PR. It was like the last thing I did at that company. I said, you know what? I'm not leaving this company until I get a PR for this.
You're that guy that
Yeah.
like joined the company to make the change and then left.
Yeah.
Um,
It's exactly what happened. Um, and I submitted the PR, found out later that the PR was like basically just deleted. They didn't care, right? And that's why I feel so strongly, and you can sense the frustration when I talk about certain patterns or certain things in software. One of them being sacred cows is because it stifles innovation. It
yeah.
just snuffs it out, right? You want to do this thing, but you can't because we're afraid, right? That's usually what happens, right? Like we're afraid of the unknown. We don't know this thing, but it works, so you don't do it, right? You
Yeah.
don't even touch it. So getting away from sacred cows. I mentioned that for me, one of the ways I think that you can navigate away from sacred cows or that you have to break down those walls is by understanding.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So once you
Absolutely. Like,
understand it, yeah, once you understand it, then you can take your case, right? You can make your case. I didn't mean to cut you off.
no, you're good. You're good. I think like, but I do think that that's exactly like you said, we're going to come back to like, how do you get rid of sacred cows? And I think there's some opinionation, right? And some mental mindset there. But I think that when you're like, I'm going to talk about the external sacred cows first, because I think those are easier to get rid of, just honestly, because we see them. They're a sacred cow, right? I think it's harder to get rid of my sacred cows because I don't necessarily see them as sacred cows. I see them as like battles hard won over years and years of experience. So let's talk about that in a second, because where I'm intimately familiar with those, understanding isn't going to help me get rid of them. But other people's sacred cows is like starting to like whittle away that is like one, understanding it for sure. Like, what does this thing actually do? And I mean, when you were telling that story about like the black box and with record and stuff, the thing that really stood out to me is, well, two things, I guess. Is like one, like this is a strong value towards an open source mindset in your company. And that doesn't mean you have to have like stuff that's open source and out on the market, but the idea that anybody can submit a PR to fix a thing, that like nobody has to stay their lane, because that by itself is a sacred cow, right? It's like, this is
Yep.
mine and that's yours. And I think clear lines of ownership are good until those ownerships become combative to the ability to make changes outside of your scope. Ownership shouldn't become a problem in making changes outside of your scope. It should give you a clear line of delineation of like, what should I care about, right? And so that idea of like, this is yours and that's mine. So having a good open source mindset in your company, that like everybody is able to submit a PR to fix a thing. That's, I think, really important. But then the second thing that stood out to me is like, so that's in order to learn a thing, but is just the ability to engage in something and to like whittle away at its like to find the weaknesses in it, right? Like you mentioned hawks, and like, I'm not one of those folks that's going to knock things that are old. Like I know that that's sort of like in vogue, is like we sit in this current moment and we're like, oh well, the stuff they used to do, that's garbage, and now all the stuff that we're doing now is built on the stuff that they used to do. A lot of it looks the same. Like the first time I saw
Yeah.
React, man, I was like, oh, this is PHP but in the client, because it looked a lot like it. I was like, I just inject a variable, and I'd written a lot of PHP at that point. And so I was like, oh, okay, that's what this is. And obviously it's not exactly that, but it's starting to sort of trend back that way with server-side rendering anyways. All that to say that like everything's an evolution. And when I look at a hawk and I'm like, okay, well, what are we using this hawk for or whatever? Like, I'm not going to say like, oh, that hawk's bad. But if I'm using it in a way that now there's like the lessons learned have moved on, right? And now we have a different pattern. I can start to like talk through the strengths and weaknesses of the patterns that exist here, and like the stability of the software. I like to like, and it's funny that you mentioned that a lot of these things exist as like people like leave and come into the company, because I've started to think, I have this theory of software development that I'm working through. That's like the true demonstration of like your skill as a software engineer isn't necessarily your ability to complete a feature or your ability to push code or my ability to complete a feature. It's the ability for me to do that in a way that allows the next person to come and change what I did. Like if I build things in a way that like, I mean, job security, but that I'm
Yeah.
the only one that knows what's going on. Like I would like, I mean, we talked about this, that like we are building a world together. That's what software engineering is. And if I build parts of that world in a way that nobody else can build that part of the world, like this is my own little private island. Um, like there's just a very big weakness in that because we're increasing the bus factor. And then once the bus comes, I get on the bus and I leave. And then like I've left this little void in the world that's now like nobody can touch it because it's sacred. And so I definitely, as you were talking, those are the things that sort of stood out to me. It's like this idea that like the next person, we have to, I mean, we talk about knowledge transfers all the time in software engineering and, increasing our bus factor and stuff like that. But one of those knowledge transfers should be just the ability to decompose that code and to change it. Like the best way to know that you understand something is to make a change. Because if I can change in scope, then I definitely understand it. And so that's, I think, what stands out to me about that is like, there's something to be said. I think I remember way back at USAA, friends of mine talking about code that they had written like 6 or 10 years ago that was still running in production. And I think there's a value to that. I really do. I don't want to knock that. Like there is a value to that. But there's also a cost when that same code is running in production for 10 years. It means nobody else changed that. And I think that that's a testament to the testament to code is how long it's stable or how long it can be changed without having to be rewritten. But that doesn't mean that it shouldn't be changed.
Yeah, there's a lot going on in there that I thought about. I was thinking about that too. When I think about like innovation and sacred cows, right? Sacred cows kind of says to me, it says that here's this thing that's already been done, and we're going to leave it as such,
Yeah,
like
exactly.
untouched. And then there's the other part that says, hey, we got to innovate and go forward, but not necessarily to the next trendy thing. Because
Yeah,
I see that, and I love that you called out like the fact that something has been running in production for 10, 20 years. A lot of the stuff that's like on these mainframes, right? They've been running forever
yeah,
and they work and they're stable. So that's a testament to, you know, the the robustness of that code or of those designs. And sometimes you don't need to change them, right? So that's a good thing.
yeah,
But I also like the idea or coming back to the fact of that the next best thing, it's really usually just built on what has already been built, right? So,
yeah,
you think about in JavaScript is like probably like the worst web
yeah,
development. It's the worst because every 2 seconds there's like another framework, right? And there's another framework, there's another pattern, and it's really just a regurgitation of the previous patterns, and then they just kind of compile these two or three patterns together, and then you have this new thing, and then oh, this is slow, so we just make it a little bit faster, and then it all of a sudden becomes the next great thing, and and then it itself will at some point become a sacred cow. We don't touch it. This is what we use. This is the pattern, right? Because we're saying that it's more than just a piece of code. It can be a pattern. It can be a process. And we put these in place and we put them up on a pedestal, and there they stay for the longest time. We know that the React documentary came out like
yeah.
a month or 2 months ago, right? And we saw that.
Right.
And in the very beginning, everybody rejected React. They were like, what are you doing? Right? There's no separation of concerns, right? You're putting your CSS and your
Everything. Yeah.
HTML and your JavaScript. What are you doing? You're mad, right? You're crazy because we had these patterns and processes in place, and that's what everybody gets used to. And you know, as a people, we're hard to change,
Yeah. We're creatures
right?
of
We
habit for sure.
creatures of habit, exactly. And so when somebody introduces this new thing, we fight it.
Yeah.
It's a perfect example of stifling innovation. If you watch that document, if anybody who has not seen the React documentary, and you're like in front end development, you have to watch
Yeah.
it. Because I can't remember the guy's name, but the main creator, right, the main contributor, the one that kind of helped start all this up. But it can I can imagine being in his shoes. You introduce this thing, as a different way of doing something, not necessarily a better way of doing something, but just a different way of doing something. And you get all this hate.
Yeah.
Right? You did. You got a lot of hate.
Yeah.
Even
Yeah.
even the in Facebook in general, they got a lot of hate. Like, what are y'all doing? Y'all are Facebook and y'all are doing this thing. What's wrong with y'all? Y'all should know better.
Yeah.
And it can be just like demoralizing. Like I tried to, present a different solution, not necessarily a better one, but a different one. And here comes this hate because we've got these structures in place, right? These sacred cows that we need to maintain.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, okay, we come back to the understanding part. As we understand what they were doing, then we start to appreciate it a little bit more, right? And I think that understanding is a huge part of it when we're
Yeah.
going to make changes to the structures that we put in place.
Yeah. I sort of want to talk about two different things that kind of come out of that. And first is like I love that you're calling out, coming from curious. And I'm going to loop back to that in a second. But the second is like really deciding what we care about. And this is an overarching theme that you and I talked about quite a bit. But like I had to explicitly ask this question recently. And it was like, it goes something like this: like, do you care? Like, do you trust me? That's the question. Do you trust me? Right. And if you trust me, do you trust me enough to not care that I want to do things differently than you're doing them? And that's a really important question because, like, I mean, like just something as simple as like, hey, I don't want to do Scrum. I'm not a Scrum guy. I'm a Kanban guy, or whatever, or I'm a Scrum man, or I mean, maybe I'm Waterfall. Like,
Yep.
I'm not Waterfall, but maybe it's okay. Like, but like the idea being that like I'm going to follow some different processes, and like if you trust me, you'll be okay with me throwing out all of that and doing it the way that works best for me and the team. Like you'll trust me to make those decisions. And that's, I think, really important. It's like because that hate is pretty, I mean, it's strong in especially in the JavaScript ecosystem, unfortunately. And that kind of leads me to like this, the second part is like coming from curious and like understanding, because like, I mean, you mentioned this even, I think just yesterday, and that's that like, I think I've been the other guy in the past. I've been the strongly opinionated sacred cows guy. And I can tell you one story that's completely unrelated to any of the work that we've done. But a few years back, probably, well, it's probably been like 6 years now, somebody recommended that I learn a little language called Rust. And I was like, no, I don't need to know Rust. C's better. C's the bee's knees. Everything is written in C. C is not going anywhere. It's never dying. And like really like, giving Rust a really hard time, and kind of not just giving it a hard time. I want to like, I'm sort of like letting some of the skeletons out of my closet here, but giving people a hard time for learning Rust instead of C. It's like you see everything's written in C. Well, 6 years later, that opinion didn't hold water. I haven't written C in several years now, and I've written a lot of Rust since then, because it turns out Rust is a pretty good language, and they have some great concepts inside of it. And we just recently saw the first integrations of Rust into the Linux kernel, and like it really, I think, starts from coming from curious. And how I think of that is that somebody published a book eventually that was like Rust and WASM, writing web games in Rust, and I was like, that sounds interesting. But it's not C, it's Rust. So I gotta like, maybe Rust is good for this one thing. And it turns out that it is pretty good for that one thing, but it's good for a lot of other things too. And so like, I was like, well, I'll just go and play with it a little bit. And went through this book, the Rust WASM Handbook. If anybody's curious, it's a really great read, and you'll build some fun web games in Rust, which is always fun. And but going through it, I was like, okay, this is really powerful, and it does do some things that I wish C did. Like, hey, I have memory allocation safety. That's great. Like C sort of just like whatever like C is like the Java, like it's a little like JavaScript, right? And it's like, oh, I just trust you to do the thing. And
Right.
Rust is like maybe I'll check that for you. And so they have this whole like borrow checker, not important. Anyways, the idea is that like coming from curious, because at first when somebody said that, I was immediately antagonistic to it. I was like, I know C, I don't need Java, or I don't need Rust. And then, but being curious about Rust helped me to realize that like C is not the sacred cow. Are they both useful? Yes. Do I think they'll both be around for a long time? Well, now Rust's in the kernel. It's not going anywhere. Um, and so like I think that's really at the core is like what you're saying. Come from curious, try to understand it. And that's true of other people's sacred cows. And I think it's easy for us to do with other people's sacred cows. It's hard for us to do with our own and to ask, like, why am I holding on to this? Why am I holding? And like Webpack is a great, I think, recent example. Uh,
Yep.
me and Webpack. My story of Webpack is deep. I can write a Webpack config. That's something I can say, I think, on this call without feeling too pat myself on the back. And a few years, or I guess 2 years ago, our crew at Stored was like, "Hey, Randy, you should look into this Vite thing." And I was like, "Yeah, okay, I'll look into it." And 6 months later or so, like I knew that internal resistance, and I tried to be very transparent. Like I know Webpack, like there's I feel pretty confident saying that there aren't many problems in Webpack I can't solve. And so like I'm very comfortable there, right? And Vita is undiscovered country. And so then I looked at it, I played with it, I used it. I was like, okay, it's cool, it's fast, I can use Vite. And then a year later, Ram comes to me. It's like, hey, we should use Vite for all of the Anvil stuff. That's you, right? And I'm like, we can't use it because of this and this and this. And like I think you saw right through those as the excuses that they were, because I'm very comfortable in the Webpack world. So like I'm just going to tell everybody on the call exactly what you did, and that is that you just started pushing repos with Vite. You're like, okay, that's nice, that's Randy's opinion, and we're just going to like barrel past it. And I tried to be pretty transparent that like part of that is that I have I feel very comfortable in Webpack, and so it's like a whole new world. But in any case, now we've got all of this infrastructure around Vite, and so I've had to sort of like adjust to it, and it's working fine.
Yeah, I love that you called out that comfortable factor, right? We get comfortable. We get super comfortable doing this thing. And I always recount this story when I was at USA. My first couple of months, years there, I would always come in and I would wonder why are all these more senior tenured developers, why do they just seem so comfortable? Like they didn't do hackathons, they didn't try to do any innovation stuff, they didn't try to change anything,
Yeah.
right? And that's not a knock on them, but you get comfortable. We just get comfortable. I get comfortable doing certain things. Again, back to we're creatures of habit. We do the same thing. It becomes easy. Then we just rinse and repeat, and it doesn't take a lot of effort, right? If you can write
Right.
Webpack like nobody's business, then next time you have to spin one up or modify one, it doesn't take hardly any
Right.
effort. You're in and out,
Exactly.
right? And
Exactly.
um, but I love that we're getting to the point, especially with Anvil, we're getting to the point, and I think we're pretty much there. Uh, we talked about understanding. The other part is being like communicative about it. Just saying,
Mhm.
hey, look, I don't want, I'm not looking to be the rock star. And if you're going to be the rock star, I'm going to call you out,
Yeah.
right? We don't want any rock stars or heroes. We just want,
None.
you said this on the podcast, I think last season, the users, they don't care about your code base. They don't care if it's a Webpack config that
Right.
bundles. They don't care if it's Beat. They don't care if it's React or Vue. You know what they care about? They care that the page loads within like half a second, right?
Yeah.
When they click the button, it's there. They don't care that your backend is in Java or Python. What what allows them to use the thing and use it in a consistent manner that's predictable? It's like I was watching a video the other day, right? And McDonald's. You can I don't go to I haven't eaten McDonald's in a while, but you can go to one McDonald's and go to another McDonald's in another part of the country, basically, and you're gonna get almost the identical experience, right?
Hmm.
Because it's consistent. And people do that. You go to one and go to the other, you're traveling, you're like, hey, I'm going to McDonald's, right? Because you can get what you like.
Yeah.
And so there's consistency there. As a customer, I don't really care like who's serving this up to me, right?
Right.
Hey, Bob is my favorite, counter person at this McDonald's. I don't care that like Susan's at the other one. I just care that when you order it, you're going to get the same thing. And it's the same thing we get as developers. We develop these, and I started to like about time. I finally started a YouTube series, and
Yeah.
one of the first videos I'm talking about is opinion. We as developers, as engineers, we get so opinionated that we get fixed on these things. We develop these sacred cows, we develop these structures, um, and we have to be able to identify them. right? And you mentioned this, right, with Veek, right, and with other stuff too. Like we have to identify that, hey, for me, this is a sacred cow. Um, uh, Lewis was uh, Lewis was doing something the other day, and he was talking about using like YK or something. I'm not really sure the package, and then you were talking about launch. I mean, the tool. And you're like, why don't you use SED because you know I'm a lot more comfortable with that, or whatever it is. And it in reality, um, when you're building stuff, you gotta make it and make it better, right? Like you said
Yeah.
before, make it and make it better. You can always come back and revisit. If you never get there because of these structures, sacred cows, whatever we want to call them, if we never get to production, our users don't exist because we don't have any, because we've been spinning our wheels debating, you know, I have a hard stance on this, you have a hard stance on that, Lewis might have a hard stance, and we don't get anywhere.
Yeah.
So identification is probably like one of the first steps that needs to happen.
Yeah, I think that's real. And then like I think identification, you called out communication though. We just had this conversation on Anvil internally yesterday. We can have it here. And that's just the importance of saying like, hey, if somebody is trying to be that rock star developer, we need to be really explicit about calling it out. We don't want rock stars. Like we don't want people that are like, I'm amazing, I can do everything. We want team players. I think like we both borrow a lot from Coach Pop in this mindset of like we want team ball, good fundamentals, good execution. Who shoots the basket matters much less than that everybody touches the ball. Um, I think that's like high touch basketball, right? And I think that's really key. You also mentioned in there like the whole idea of like make it work, then make it better. This is something that I've been, I think, saying quite a bit lately at work and also with Anvil. It's like I'm getting to the place where like you hear these conversations and especially in startups about like one way and two way doors. I feel very confident saying that not much in software is a one way door. Like everything is fixable, undoable, changeable in software. And especially if we engineer for change. This is one of the, one we've had a lot of conversations internally about like what are the principles and of Anvil, right? And one of the first ones is like engineer for change. Like let's just plan for change and be adaptable. So that we don't have to be so stuck on like, oh, is this a hard decision? No, we'll just change it later. If it ends up being the wrong decision, we'll just change it later. That's okay. Feedback is a gift, right? Um, and so that's really, really key. And then the last thing that you said that like, and you started here, but I want to end here because I think it's maybe the most important combat for a sacred cow. And that is care what your user cares about. Like care about what your user cares about. Like that's because at the end of the day, that's what matters, right? Is if your user doesn't care about V or Webpack or whatever, like, do what makes engineering lives easier. If your user cares about it, you should care about it because that's what's going to drive adoption. It's what's going to drive growth for your company. Like one thing that I'm learning right now is that the best engineers in the world aren't a guarantee that you will have a good, successful startup. You can have really good engineers and your company can still fail, especially if all of your best engineers are focused on engineering problems. You need really good engineers that are focused on people, the user problems. Because if at the end of the day, you have to care about what your user cares about. And that is, I think, the biggest antidote to sacred cows. Because in any room, when you're debating the merits about something, you can always just ask, hey, y'all, do our users care? Because if our users don't care, probably we care too much.